Thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me here today. Apologies for coming in slightly late to the previous session. I blame Ryanair and British Airways and German railway system, everybody really apart from myself, which is a little bit like perhaps David Cameron and Brexit. We're going to get his autobiography coming out next week, which I shall be, I think next week or the week after, which I shall be poring over for any signs of an apology or, yes, remorse. But at least some explanation, perhaps, of the logic that led him to a referendum. And then also his decision to quit the stage when he lost that referendum, leaving his successor and his party to clear up the mess, something they have found very, very difficult to do. Now, I'm going to stray a little bit into Klaus's territory today because I'd like to talk about the Conservative Party in the context of the British party system. And if we go back to brass tacks, and we think about, well, the definition of a party system, it's the pattern of competition which is more or less structured between parties in a bounded polity. And we normally measure it by the number of parties and by the ideological spread of those parties. And so I guess one of the things that we're here to do right now is to think about, well, how has that changed since 2015, since before Brexit, if we can imagine that period. I've almost forgotten what it was like when we didn't discuss this day in and day out. Now, you could make the argument that actually things haven't changed that much. The number of parties, and I'm sure Klaus will go on to talk about this, has not really changed. We've just seen, if you like, UKIP, the United Kingdom Independence Party, replaced by the Brexit Party. There are some differences between them, which we can talk about. But apart from that, we have basically a similar number of parties in the system. What we certainly do have is obviously polarisation between the Labour Party and the Conservative Party. But I'd like to start with a kind of caveat and a qualification to that, and it is in particular regarding the Conservative Party. I think it is true to say we've had a polarisation, and we can talk about this a little bit later, when it comes to the authoritarian-libertarian scale. If we go with the jargon and talk about Galtan, so green, alternative, libertarian versus traditionalist, authoritarian, nationalist, then it does seem to me quite clear that while Labour maybe hasn't moved towards the GAL position as much as some people suggest, and we can talk about that clearly later on, the Conservatives had clearly made a move towards the tan side, if you like, of that particular dimension. The Conservatives, however, haven't, it seems to me, moved to become the right-wing party of Jeremy Corbyn's fantasies when it comes to the market state dimension, the left-right dimension, if you want to call it that, that traditional dimension revolving around questions of the distribution of wealth and the extent to which the state should intervene in the economy and, of course, public spending. Because, as many of you will have noticed, if you could tear your eyes away from the shenanigans over Brexit last week, the Conservative Party's new Chancellor, Sajid Javid, introduced a new spending review in which he made it clear he was moving away from austerity, in which he has considerably upped spending on all those things that we traditionally associate with the Labour Party, so the National Health Service, schools, and although maybe more associated with the Conservative Party, policing in particular. And he's going to do that by borrowing more. One thing the Conservative Party, I guess, hasn't changed in this dimension is its lack of enthusiasm for funding its spending via tax increases. But from a party which had committed itself almost in sort of Germanic fashion to a balanced budget, or at least that as an aspiration. It's clearly moved away from that. So I think it is a little bit complicated to say that the Conservative Party has moved to the right. Perhaps it has on one dimension, the cultural dimension, but on the economic and social dimension, it doesn't seem to be quite as enthusiastic as it has been to shrink the state. Indeed, it seems to want to build the state back up again. If we look at some of the other parties in the system, but particularly those parties that affect the Conservative Party, then again, we could say there hasn't been quite as much change as some people sometimes suggest. The Brexit Party, I would say, is no more or less populist radical right than UKIP were. It has a different structure. It's moved even beyond the Geert Wilders form of organisation, where he is the only party member, because the Brexit Party has no party members at all. For those of you who may not have noticed this, it is simply a company set up by Nigel Farage and a few of his friends. There is absolutely no democracy there, which was always, of course, the problem for Nigel Farage when it came to UKIP. But in terms of its policies, although we don't know much about them, it doesn't seem to me to be that different from UKIP. The only major policy announcement we've had, apart from Brexit, is that it wants to scrap inheritance tax. Whether it will actually ever be capable of doing that, or whether it will be able to persuade the Conservative Party to do that, will be an interesting one to watch. There hasn't been much change, I think, in the Liberal Democrats either. They continue to oscillate between being a social liberal party on the centre-left and a market liberal party on the right. But they still constitute, for the Conservative Party anyway, in some ways, a kind of secondary threat or secondary challenge, because as many of you will know, it is the Liberal Democrats who are second to the Conservatives in a number of seats where possibly in an imminent general election they could pose a threat to the Conservative Party's hold on those seats. It's easy to forget after the debacle of 2015 that the Liberal Democrats had something nearly 60 seats in 2010 when they went into coalition with the Conservatives. I'm not saying necessarily they could win all of those back, and they will have trouble, I think, dislodging the Conservatives in the southwest, because in some ways those seats were always living on borrowed time, I think. But they could certainly eat into the Conservatives' seat share and therefore their hold on power. And so the Conservatives in some ways face a double whammy, a dual threat, if you like. But I want to concentrate really on the most obvious threat to the Conservative Party, and that clearly is the Brexit Party. If we look at the European Parliament elections earlier this year, where the Conservative Party polled under 10% in a national election for the first time in, well, I would say living memory, but almost in memory, you can explain everything that Boris Johnson has been up to for the last couple of months. We often use the phrase, too often use the phrase perhaps, existential threat. But I think many Conservatives did regard the vote share that they got in those elections as an existential threat. In other words, I think when some Conservatives say, that if they can't deliver Brexit, then, it could be extinction for the Conservative Party, there's an element of hyperbole in that, but I think they are seriously worried about it. And that is why, to coin a phrase, perhaps I shouldn't say this when I'm in Germany, it's a German word, I've just realised, I mean, Boris Johnson has been about turning the Conservatives into an ersatz Brexit party for the last 2 months. Now, whether that will work or not, I think, is a moot point. Because clearly, as we've already mentioned, there is this dual threat, and therefore the Conservatives are facing a fairly obvious trade-off. The more that they move towards the Brexit Party's agenda, the more space they leave on their moderate Remainer flank, and therefore the more vulnerable they may be to the Liberal Democrat challenge. And it is not altogether clear that the other part of the strategy for Boris Johnson, in other words, the idea that they will be able to win Labour marginals in Labour Leave voting seats, is actually any more credible than it was when Theresa May tried exactly the same thing in 2017. That was the plan then, and it's simply founded on the fact that many Labour voters who voted Leave in 2016 returned home to the Labour Party in 2017 and did not therefore deliver the number of marginal seats, and sometimes even some people hoped safe Labour seats to the Conservatives, hence her loss of her majority. It's always possible that this time will be different, that this time those Labour leavers will actually move directly into the Conservative column. There is some suggestion from very recent polls that that might be happening, but whether it will happen to anything like the extent that the Conservatives need it to happen, I think is debatable at best and perhaps actually quite doubtful. So we have a very big question coming up, which is, if the Brexit Party doesn't go away, and if Labour can't win back Liberal Democrat Remainers, and it can't win under Corbyn, then will the first past the post system be able to exercise its normal restraining and suppressing effect? In other words, will we be in a situation which is completely new to us? So will the Conservative Party, even if it manages to retain something over 30%, be able to win a general election simply because the Labour Party is only able to win in the low 20s? Now, I would love to say that everything will change, that the entire system, will explode and we'll see something really, really interesting this time around. But we've heard that all before, and first past the post has done its rather depressing work, whatever people were hoping for. It may happen this time, but I would caution us into believing that it's necessarily going to be very different this time around. The major choice facing the Conservative Party now is whether it does some kind of deal with Nigel Farage and the Brexit Party, or whether it pursues the strategy it's been pursuing over the last 2 months, which is to try and avoid doing such a deal by essentially becoming the Brexit Party to all intents and purposes. At the moment, you'd have to say that strategy has worked reasonably well. If you look at the Conservative Party's performance, it was always a little bit better in Westminster voting intention polls than it was in the European Parliament elections. But nevertheless, we're talking about a Conservative Party that even in the latest sort of not particularly impressive poll is polling just over 30%, and in some polls 35%. So you could say that it's working in that sense. But is it going to be enough? And is it going to actually persuade Conservatives that they should, I think rightly, carry on refusing Nigel Farage's offer of some kind of formal pact or stand-down arrangement? I think it would be a mistake for the Conservative Party to do that, because it would essentially allow the Brexit Party into Parliament. It would allow, if you like, the cuckoo into the nest. And I'm not sure that we could guarantee that those MPs would ever disappear in the way that, say, Douglas Carswell and his fellow MP, whose name I've now forgotten, so memorable was he, Mark Reckless, in the way that they disappeared. Yes. So I think that's one reason why it would be very unwise in the long term, and you can go right back to the early 20th century when the Liberal Party decided to do some similar arrangement with the Labour Party, and we all know what happened to the Liberal Party and the Labour Party thereafter. Very bad idea, I think, to let your opponents have that kind of chance. But also I think that it would taint the Conservative Party by association. There was a reason why Nigel Farage did not lead the Leave campaign in 2016, and the same thing applies. There are many voters who would be put off, I think, voting Conservative if they felt the Conservative Party had too close a relationship with Nigel Farage. So that's the challenge facing the Conservative Party. Looking more generally at the UK party system, and Klaus will obviously say a little bit more about this, we could say then that things don't appear to have changed that much. Similar lineup of parties, ideological spread, perhaps not that much greater than it was if you take the two extremes, which would be, I guess, the Brexit party on the one hand and perhaps the Greens or maybe Labour on the other. But of course that's looking at it from the outside. If you look from the inside, you would have to argue that the Conservative Party has, to some extent, I think, become a populist, radical right party in all but name. It is, I think, irrevocably nationalistic, more so than it's ever been. It is running, in terms of its rhetoric, a highly populist campaign, the people versus Parliament, the people versus the elite. It is focusing its efforts not just on repairing the damage done to the health service and to education, but focusing its efforts on law and order and on immigration. And the appointment of Priti Patel as Home Office Minister is, I think, extremely telling, as is Boris Johnson's appearance in front of the serried ranks of the police cadets, and you all saw those photos. In some ways, it's moving towards the kind of populist radical right formula that is familiar to many of us who study Western Europe as well. So it is a mixture of kind of cultural conservatism and populism and some welfare support shading into welfare chauvinism, and of course it has a terribly charismatic leader, which is something that is often the case with these parties. But a word of caution to finish up. It is perfectly possible that this is a short-term strategy to see off the Brexit party, and then, having done that, if it is done, for the Conservative Party under Boris Johnson to pivot back towards the kind of liberal Toryism, the kind of one-nation conservatism that so many Tories still like to hold on to. We are talking about the world's oldest and most successful party, which has a reputation for morphing and mutating when it feels the need to. And we are talking about a leader who has reinvented himself on several occasions quite successfully. But there is a caveat to the caveat. Obviously, the Conservatives over the last 2 months have done a great deal to establish this populist right brand. And in some ways, it doesn't necessarily run against the grain of conservatism to have done that. In other words, it perhaps is the logical direction for the Conservative Party to go in. So I'm not sure that having gone down that track, the Conservative Party will be able to exercise that three-point turn in the road, as it were, and go back to being what it was. And one reason I think that, and here's where I finish, but with partly with an advert, is the membership. Very kindly, you mentioned the book. This is the book, Foot Soldiers, Political Party Membership in the 21st Century. If you look at Conservative Party members, they are not so very different from the members of UKIP, who are the people we studied here, and I suspect those people who are now adherents of the Brexit Party. They are culturally, socially incredibly conservative. They are incredibly, as we know, pro-Brexit, and you probably saw the opinion polls which showed that the majority of Conservative Party members would rather see their party smashed, although not by Jeremy Corbyn, they hoped, than fail to deliver Brexit, who would rather Scotland left the Union than fail to deliver Brexit, who would rather Northern Ireland went back to the Republic rather than fail to deliver Brexit. So this is a very, very committed membership, and Boris Johnson, I think, has taken them on that journey even further and will not, I think, be able to get them off as easily perhaps as he thinks. And anyone who says, well, the Conservative Party membership, what do they matter? The Conservative Party membership has no formal say in the policy of the Conservative Party, needs to remember the big paradox of British politics really over the last decade or so, which is the party members who have the least formal say, I would argue, in their party's policy have actually had the most influence on party policy. And I'm not sure that the Conservative Party therefore can put the genie back in the bottle. Thank you. Okay.